Okay, so what have we looked at so far in this class? Well, we've gone over the fundamentals of logic, argumentation, and rhetoric. We've looked at 2 case studies so far. One case study looked at Russell's problems of philosophy, in which he's introducing us to some of the fundamental questions that philosophers ask and how they think. And then we looked at kind of a historical text, a few of Descartes' Meditations, which again I think does a good job of providing an introduction to these basic questions of metaphysics and epistemology. Well, we're going to kind of continue with those themes with our next case study, which is C.S. Lewis's Miracles. And one way that you could think about this is as follows. We have all these questions about what's right, about the kind of way we should organize ourselves economically and politically. Well, what do those questions depend on? Those questions depend on figuring out what exists. For example, does God exist or does God not exist? What the heck is this thing? What is this made of? These fundamental metaphysical questions and what you feel about these things, what you think, they're going to give rise to all your other beliefs. If you think that God exists, that's going to compel you to believe in certain things. If you don't think that God exists, that's going to compel you to believe in other things. If you think that everything is just made up of matter, that's going to have downstream effects on what you believe about morality and politics and all that. And perhaps even more fundamental to those questions, what exists and how does it work, are questions of epistemology. Because if we don't understand what knowledge is, how we can know things, what knowledge even means, well, how can we know what is and what is real, and those things on which politics, society, culture, anthropology, all that crap depends? Lewis is going to be investigating these questions as well, but he's going to be doing it through a different kind of framing. In this book, he's going to try to answer the question, are miracles possible? And if they're possible, do they occur? The answers to these questions are going to have profound influences on the rest of your beliefs. So, this is not just a meaningless exercise. This is going to be one that is, again, going to exercise our critical thinking capacities, and it's going to take us further into our exploration of these fundamental questions we have about what is not, what is real, and how we can know that. So, we're going to start off today by looking at the first 2 chapters. So, please pull up your reading and go to chapter 1. The scope of this book. He starts off with a quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics. Those who wish to succeed must ask the right preliminary questions. This is basically just another way of stating what I have been relaying to you today. Metaphysics is important, epistemology is important, it's going to influence all the rest. So what you think about what is, and what you think about how it is that you come to know things, and how that works, is going to influence everything else. So if we're going to investigate something, we have to start with the right questions. I would say these are the right questions we should be asking. And so he starts. In all my life, I have met only one person who claims to have seen a ghost. And the interesting thing about the story is that the person disbelieved in the immortal soul before she saw the ghost, and still disbelieves after seeing it. She says that what she saw must have been an illusion or a trick of the nerves. And obviously she may be right. Seeing is not believing. And this is one of the central things that Russell tried to clue us into, right? As well as Descartes with the whole doubting of the senses. For this reason, the question whether miracles occur can never be answered simply by experience. Okay, so if we're trying to figure out if miracles occur, we can't just look at our experiences. They're not going to clue us into the possibility of their existence. We have to ask more logical, objective questions, you might say. A priori questions. Every event which might claim to be a miracle is, in the last resort, something presented to our senses. Something seen, heard, touched, smelled, or tasted. And our senses are not infallible. Where have you heard that before? If anything extraordinary seems to have happened, we can always say that we have been the victims of an illusion. If we hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural, this is what we shall always say. What we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. It is therefore useless to appeal to experience before we have settled, as well as we can, the philosophical question. And so he's bringing up just a really important general idea here. How you interpret the things that are going to happen to you in life is going to be influenced by the kind of philosophy that you have. What an event means to you, the impact something has for you, is going to influence how you interpret it, what you think happened. For example, if you don't have the idea that there are venomous snakes of a certain color and other snakes that have the same color just in a different pattern, when a snake of that color bites you, you're going to think that you're dead, right? It's because you don't have the proper framework, the proper knowledge to interpret your experience and evaluate it. So, we all come to the table with these experiences, with these views, with these perspectives. But if we're trying to answer fundamental questions, we need to be able to bracket that stuff and try to look at things logically and objectively, right? Otherwise, our bias and our experiences are going to color what we think of all this stuff from the get-go, and we won't even realize it. So keep that in mind when you're conversing with other people, when you're analyzing a text. It's always good to interrogate, I'm having this kind of reaction or this kind of thought to what I'm hearing or reading. Why is that? What kind of presuppositions do I bring to the table? How are my perspectives or beliefs coloring this thing that I'm experiencing right now? If immediate experience cannot prove or disprove the miraculous, still less can history do so. Many people think one can decide whether a miracle occurred in the past by explaining the evidence, quote, according to the ordinary rules of historical inquiry. But the ordinary rules cannot be worked until we have decided whether miracles are possible in the first place, and if so, how probable they are. For if they are impossible, then no amount of historical evidence will convince us. If they are possible but immensely improbable, then only mathematically demonstrative evidence will convince us. And since history never provides that degree of evidence for any event, history can never convince us that a miracle occurred. If, on the other hand, miracles are not intrinsically improbable, then the existing evidence will be sufficient to convince us that quite a number of miracles have occurred. The result of our historical inquiries thus depends on the philosophical views which we have been holding before we even began to look at the evidence. The philosophical question must therefore come first. So, in order to evaluate all this crap, what's going on, how it works, first we need to look at these fundamental philosophical disciplines: metaphysics and epistemology. Because if we don't know what presuppositions or frames we're bringing to the table, Well, that's going to prevent us from really knowing whether or not we are correct in our analyses. Here's an example of the sort of thing that happens if we omit the preliminary philosophical task and rush on to the historical. In a popular commentary on the Bible, you will find a discussion of the date at which the fourth gospel was written. The author says it must have been written after the execution of St. Peter, because in the fourth gospel, Christ is represented as predicting the execution of St. Peter. A book, thinks the author, cannot be written before events which it refers to. Of course it cannot, unless real predictions ever occur. If they do, then this argument for the date is in ruins. And the author has not discussed at all whether real predictions are possible. He takes it for granted, perhaps unconsciously, that they are not. Perhaps he is right. But if he is, he has not discovered this principle by historical inquiry. He has brought his disbelief in predictions to his historical work, so to speak, ready-made. Unless he had done so, and his historical conclusion about the date of the fourth gospel could not have been reached at all. His work is therefore quite useless to a person who wants to know whether predictions occur. The author gets to work only after he has already answered that question in the negative, and on grounds which he never communicates to us. This book is intended as a preliminary to historical inquiry. I am not a trained historian, and I shall not examine the historical evidence for the Christian miracles. My effort is to put my readers in a position to do so. It is no use going to the text until we have some idea about the possibility or probability of the miraculous. Those who assume that miracles cannot happen are merely wasting their time by looking into the texts. We know in advance what results they will find, for they have begun by begging the question. So, what do you think he is implying there about how we should address these questions? And about how we should address whether or not miracles can occur? We say that when we're talking with people or trying to come to the truth, we should be not closed-minded, but open-minded, right? And so what I think he's trying to get at here is, again, the beliefs and presuppositions that you bring to the table. Whenever you look at something, is going to color how you view that thing. But if we're trying to get to the truth, we need to be able to, investigate those beliefs and presuppositions themselves. I take it that nobody here has proven or disproven the existence of miracles, right? Now, certainly you have certain beliefs about them. But when we're doing philosophy, and I would argue when you're trying to come to the truth about any matter, you should seek to understand the kind of worldview that you have, how you came to it, and how that is going to influence your evaluations and your analysis. And so, if your goal in life is to figure this out, come to the truth, come to knowledge, I would highly encourage you all to not assume something can or cannot be the case from the get-go. Let's look at these things logically. Let's pay attention to our own intuitions. Let's look at the arguments and see where they lead. If we do that, I do not think we can be led astray. So, let's just, for the sake of argument, say we're going to proceed with an open mind. We're going to follow the logic where it leads. Sound reasonable? It's at least reasonable if you want to be a rational person, right? Maybe you don't care about that at all, but we'll talk about that at the end of this class. Whether logic, rationality, rhetoric are even good, whether we should value them, all that stuff. Okay, any questions so far? What he's going to get into in the next chapter is everybody has a belief on miracles, whether they exist or not. What ideas or concepts do those beliefs depend on? What kind of question do we have to ask first? Well, it has to do with our view of what all this is and how it got here. Hence, the aptly titled second chapter, The Naturalist and the Supernaturalist. And he starts off with a quote. "Gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Snip. "And is there a place where people venture to live above ground?" "I never heard of people living underground," replied Tim, "before I came to Giantland." "Came to Giantland?" cried Mrs. Snip. "Why, isn't everywhere Giantland?" So you can see how somebody's presuppositions, their worldview, is going to influence the kinds of beliefs that they come to, right? Whether they realize it or not. Lewis says, "I use the word miracle to mean an interference with nature by supernatural power." What do you think? Does that sound like a reasonable definition of what a miracle is? When you hear the word miracle, what do you think that means? Yeah.
Typically, when I refer something as a miracle, it's because it could have went to shit. That scenario could have went to shit. Instead, it turned out the opposite. So I can't say whether or not that implies this interference by supernatural.
So you use it more loosely, maybe.
Yeah.
If a Christian were to tell you, "Oh yeah, a miracle just occurred in my life," what do you think they would mean?
God.
Yeah.
I was going to say something that can't be explained with logic.
Something that can't be explained with logic. Maybe. How about this? Something that would not have happened if we just let things go their own way. Does that kind of fit with what people mean?
Outside of the natural order?
Perhaps. For example, we use the word miracle to describe things that are highly improbable. Sometimes we use it to describe something that seems inexplicable, right, according to our understanding of the universe. I think a lot of people who talk about miracles in the religious sense have the kind of definition that Lewis is putting forth here. And what you're going to see if you end up reading this book and continuing forward with it is he's going to defend the idea that there is interference with nature by supernatural power, at least sometimes in human history. But before he can even make that case, we need to have a discussion about, okay, what is meant by nature? What is meant by supernatural power? Does anything supernatural exist? Well, let's see. Unless there exists, in addition to nature, something else, which we may call the supernatural, there can be no miracles. Okay, so far so good, right? If miracle is intervention into the natural world by something that is outside of the natural world, if nature is all there is, then there couldn't be any miracles, right? Because there wouldn't be anything supernatural that would exist. Okay. Some people believe that nothing exists except nature. I call these people naturalists. Others think that besides nature, there exists something else. I call them supernaturalists. Okay, so these are metaphysical positions. Naturalism is the view that everything that exists is a part or a product of nature. In some sense, this is a part or a product of nature. Animals are, stars are, photons are. This is kind of like the contemporary scientific view, right? In mainstream science, you're not going to see any recourse to the supernatural, right? Because they think, look, it's all natural, man. It can all be explained in terms of physics, chemistry, biology. Okay, so those are naturalists. Others think that besides nature there exists something else. I call them supernaturalists. Supernaturalism is the view that there are things, or maybe one thing, at least one thing that exists that is above or outside of nature. So if you believe that otherworldly spirits exist, or angels, or God, or demons, or ghosts, perhaps, you're probably a supernaturalist. Because you don't think these things are, well, constrained in the same way like an atom would be in our universe. Right? They have some sort of other essence or nature, or they're not bound by the same rules that we are. Okay. So these are two positions. Our first question, therefore, is whether the naturalists or the supernaturalists are right. Yeah, which view is true? Is nature all that exists, or is there something more? And here comes our first difficulty, he says. Great. Before the naturalist and supernaturalist can begin to discuss their difference of opinion, they must surely have an agreed definition of both nature and of supernature. But unfortunately, it is almost impossible to get such a definition. Okay, so what's he saying there? How come it's hard for, let's say, Christians and atheists to have discussions about where this came from, what it is, all that stuff?
Their belief systems are in opposition.
Totally. Yeah. Think about language. Do we all mean the same thing when we use the words that we use?
No.
We have different definitions for words, right? What God means to me might not mean what God means to you, right? And so arises our first difficulty. If you're going to have a conversation with anybody, if you're going to convince them of something, if you're going to try to persuade them, you have to start by making your definitions clear, right? Because all too often in your arguments with people and your discussions, you don't have the same definitions of words. And so what happens? You go around and around and around in a circle, and if you don't address that, you'll just be talking past one another, right? For example, progressives are going to say, this whole thing is racist. Well, if you don't think racism implies some sort of structure or system, regardless of intentionality, then you're not going to agree that it's all racist, right? If you think racism is intentional discrimination based on skin color, you don't have the same definition of racism as somebody who is a progressive, right? So you'll just be talking past one another if you're trying to debate whether or not society is racist. So, we need to define our terms first. And Lewis says this is a problem. Why? Just because the naturalist thinks that nothing but nature exists, the word nature means to him merely everything, or the whole show, or whatever there is. And if that is what we mean by nature, then of course nothing else exists. If you define nature as the whole show, then yeah, that's all there is, right? But that's not how the supernaturalist defines the term. That's not how they understand what nature is. The real question between him and the supernaturalist has evaded us. Some philosophers have defined nature as what we perceive with the five senses. Okay, think about that. Nature is what we perceive with our five senses. Does that seem right to you? Is that a good definition? What do you think? Let's say we define nature as that which we perceive with our senses. Do you think that's a good definition? Does that capture what we mean when we say something is natural? What do you think?
Are you saying like something that we can perceive with the senses or something
Yeah.
that we cannot perceive with the senses?
Let's say can.
Okay, because that makes it a little better. Because the way you words it in this sounds like it's just like what you know, and that could be
What you sense, right? Yeah, so maybe can makes it a better definition. Is that how you understand what something means to be natural, though? I take it a lot of you believe that in evolution, that organisms adapt over time to their environment. Is that something that you've seen or can see with your five senses? Maybe in a lab if you're working with fruit flies, But you would say that evolution is natural, right? What Lewis is going to get at here is this is not a good definition. Why? Well, let's look at the example. This definition is unsatisfactory. For we do not perceive our own emotions in this way, and yet they are presumably natural events. Right? We don't generally think God is causing you to have all these emotions miraculously, right? You're like, no, my emotions are natural products of brain processes, right? Or whatever. In order to avoid this deadlock and to discover what the naturalist and the supernaturalist are really differing about, we must approach our problem in a more roundabout way. I begin by considering the following sentences. Are those his natural teeth or a set? The dog in his natural state is covered with fleas. I love to get away from tilled lands and metalled roads and be alone with nature. Or, do be natural. Why are you so affected? And finally, it may have been wrong to kiss her, but it was very natural. What Lewis is going to say now is, we use the word nature or natural in all these ways. That implies something about what it means for something to be natural. A common thread of meaning in all these usages can easily be discovered. The natural teeth are those which grow in the mouth. We do not have to design them, make them, or fit them. The dog's natural state is the one he will be in if no one takes soap and water and prevents it. The countryside where nature reigns supreme is the one where soil, weather, and vegetation produce their results unhelped and unimpeded by men. Natural behavior is the behavior which people would exhibit if they were not at the pains to alter it. The natural kiss is the kiss which will be given if moral or prudential considerations do not intervene. What connects all of these? It's as follows. In all of the examples, nature means what happens of itself or of its own accord. What you do not need to labor for. What you will get if you take no measures to stop it. The Greek word for nature, phusis, is connected with the Greek verb to grow. Latin, natura, with the verb to be born. The natural is what springs up or comes forth, or arrives, or goes on of its own accord. The given, what is already there, the spontaneous, the unintended, the unsolicited. Okay, so does that sound right to you? What is natural is that which springs forth from itself. Think of a plant growing, right? It's going to develop a certain structure of leaves, certain membranes naturally, if we don't get in there and snip things up, right? And mess with it. Thus, what this definition seems to be opposite to is something like artifice, artificiality, right? Something that is intentionally designed and created by human beings. So there are things that are going on of their own accord, the cells in your body doing what they're doing, the chemical processes in your brain doing what they're doing. And then there are other things that, well, are not going on of their own accord, but are the result of design or interference or intervention. Like the creation of a computer, right? A computer is not just going to grow from parts on a table, right? But a seed, if planted into the ground, is going to flower into something naturally, provided it's given water and light and all that crap. So, what we seem to mean by this word natural is what happens of itself or of its own accord. Thus, what the naturalist believes is that the ultimate fact, the thing you can't get behind, is a vast process in space and time which is going on of its own accord. Inside that total system, every particular event, such as you're sitting reading this book, happens because some other event has happened. In the long run, because the total event is happening. Each particular thing, such as this page, is what it is because other things are what they are. And so eventually, because the whole system is what it is. All the things and events are so completely interlocked that no one of them can claim the slightest independence from the whole show. None of them exists on its own or goes on of its own accord, except in the sense that it exhibits at some particular place and time that general existence on its own or behavior of its own accord, which belongs to nature, the great total interlocked event, as a whole. So, is that how we kind of conceive of nature? Do we think in some sense that all natural things are connected in some way? I think we kind of do, right? When we talk about plants growing, how do we explain that? Oh, we have to talk about the water cycle. We have to talk about the characteristics of the plants, the soil, the land. That plant grew more because an animal shit on it, right? So these natural things seem to be like interconnected and interdependent in a way. They're all subject to these same natural laws. And we can conceive of the whole thing as one giant system of a bunch of moving, interconnected parts. Yeah, okay. What were you going to say?
I think they're made of the same substance as well. I think with supernatural things, it's kind of assumed that they're made of something else.
Right. Yeah, what is this made of? The table. Atoms. Yeah, what is the chair made of?
Atoms.
What are stars made of?
Atoms.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of another idea that goes along with this, right? They're causally connected, they're interdependent, they're interlocked. And you could say what that requires is that they're all the same thing, fundamentally, or made of the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Thus, he says, no thoroughgoing naturalist believes in free will. For free will would mean that human beings have the power of independent action, the power of doing something more or other than what was involved by the total series of events. And any such separate power of originating events is what the naturalist denies. Spontaneity, originality, action on its own is a privilege reserved for the whole show, which he calls nature. Okay, so does that sound right to you? Think of the contemporary scientific view. Do the top scientists in the world believe there's free will? What do you think? Yeah.
I think because it was like a study the universe is unpredictable. Sometimes it shows some type of evidence of some type of free will.
Okay, so we're unpredictable. We're not good at predicting our behavior. Does that mean that we have free choice, though, in the matter? If we can invoke some of the metaphysical views we brought up in earlier classes, materialism, the idea that all this is made of matter, or naturalism here. If everything is just made of atoms that are following physical laws, does anybody really have a choice in what they do? Wouldn't we just say then, if we believed we're just made of atoms, well, I'm just doing what my atoms are making me do? Right? Lewis is going to say, if you think you are just a natural thing, just like a horse or a star, what is kind of also implied in that view is you're just subject to the laws of nature like anything else. And this is kind of it's an argument that's been made a lot. If you look at a lot of the atheist, materialist scientists of our day, they will say, no, we don't really have free will in the way that people mean it. Why? Well, everything that we think, say, and do is just a result of chemical reactions going on in our brain that we can't control. What was going on before that caused us to be in this situation? All that stuff. And really, if you trace back far enough, as Lewis will say in a bit, you could say the reason why anything happens is because of what things were like at the origin of the universe, the conditions of the Big Bang. I think a lot of people would accept that view. If we could know what the initial conditions were like, we could hypothetically predict everything that was going to happen. Because things follow deterministic physical laws. Now, the supernaturalist agrees with the naturalist that there must be something which exists in its own right, some basic fact whose existence it would be nonsensical to try to explain, because this fact is itself the ground or starting point of all explanations. But he does not identify this fact with the whole show. He thinks that things fall into two classes. In the first class, we find either things, or more probably one thing, which is basic and original, which exists on its own. In the second, we find things which are merely derivative from that one thing. The one basic thing has caused all other things to be. It exists on its own. They exist because it exists. They will cease to exist if it ever ceases to maintain them in existence. They will be altered if it ever alters them. Okay, what kind of picture is he painting here of the supernaturalist? What do supernaturalists tend to believe? Think of a Christian, for example. Do they think everything is natural? No. What do they think? Yes?
Everything's caused by God.
Right. Yeah, there are natural things, and then there is this thing, God, that is not natural, like an elephant or a star, that created all of this crap. Right? Right. So you could say all things that exist, the supernaturalist is going to say, oh, they're either natural or not natural. Whereas the naturalist is going to say, no, everything is just natural. There's one class of things. So here's an important point of disagreement. The difference between the two views might be expressed by saying that naturalism gives us a democratic, supernaturalism, a monarchical picture of reality. The naturalist thinks that the privilege of being on its own resides in the total mass of things, just as in a democracy, sovereignty resides in the whole mass of the people. The supernaturalist thinks that this privilege belongs to some things, or more probably one thing, and not to others. Just as in a real monarchy, the king has sovereignty and the people have not. And just as in a democracy all citizens are equal, so for the naturalist one thing or event is as good as another, in the sense that they are all equally dependent on the total system of things. Indeed, each of them is only the way in which the character of that total system exhibits itself at a particular point in space and time. The supernaturalist, on the other hand, believes that the one original or self-existent thing is on a different level from, and more important than, all other things. So you can start to see how these basic metaphysical views end up influencing some of our other beliefs. When he says that, you could say the naturalist believes in like a democratic universe, he's saying like everything is on the same level. Right? This thing's natural, this thing's natural, this thing's natural. It's all natural. It's all made of the same stuff. Maybe we think some things are more important than others because we can think about stuff, but we're just a natural thing like that dog over there. And that dog is natural just like the rock out there. But how does this differ compared to a Christian or a supernaturalist? Do they think that everything is on the same level?
They think that there's one being or entity that has control more or less over everything else.
Yeah, you could say that they think reality is hierarchical. There are levels to it. This was captured in the very influential pre-modern idea of the great chain of being. There are some things that are more real and perfect and righteous and good than other things. Things have different degrees of reality and perfection to them. And you see this if you look at the Christian worldview, for example. Are humans and animals on the same level? No, the Christian would say, for example, God put humans on earth to rule over the animals. We're above the animals in some way. And there's something above humans, right? I don't know, spirits, angels. And then what's above that? God. So already implicit in these views is this kind of idea that reality is structured in a certain way, and they're going to disagree about what that structure is. The naturalist is going to think about things as if it's a field, a level playing field kind of, and the supernaturalist is going to think about things as no, there are levels. There's a hierarchical organization. And God is at the top of that usually, right? At this point, a suspicion may occur that supernaturalism first arose from reading into the universe the structure of monarchical societies. So the reason why somebody would come to this view is, well, they were just living in a monarchical society and they just thought the whole universe was like that. But then, of course, it may with equal reason be suspected that naturalism has arisen from reading into it the structure of modern democracies. The two suspicions thus cancel out and give us no help in deciding which theory is more likely to be true. They do indeed remind us that supernaturalism is the characteristic philosophy of a monarchical age and naturalism of a democratic age, in the sense that supernaturalism, even if false, would have been believed by the great mass of unthinking people 400 years ago, just as naturalism, even if false, will be believed by the great mass of unthinking people today. Everyone will have seen that the one self-existent thing, or the small class of self-existent things, in which supernaturalists believe is what we call God or the gods. I propose for the rest of this book to treat only that form of supernaturalism which believes in one God, partly because polytheism is not likely to be a live issue for most of my readers, and partly because those who believed in many gods, very seldom in fact, regarded their gods as creators of the universe and as self-existent. The gods of Greece were not really supernatural in the strict sense which I am giving to the word. They were products of the total system of things and included within it. And a little bit more could be said about this point as well. The way that we think about God nowadays is not the same that the ancient Greeks thought about the gods and goddesses. See, for them, the primary difference between humans and the gods were the lengths of their lifespans. The gods and goddesses were jealous, wrathful, lustful. They had all the same human qualities. They just lived forever and had more power. But this is not what we think of as God now, right? Our concept of God now, we don't imagine God to have the same emotions and desires that we do. We think of God as being outside of space and time, as being completely good and perfect and righteous, as being of a whole different order than us. So, for the purposes of this book, basically he's going to try to make a case for Christian miracles. This introduces an important distinction. The difference between naturalism and supernaturalism is not exactly the same as the difference between belief in a God and disbelief. Naturalism, without ceasing to be itself, could admit of a certain kind of God. The great interlocking event called nature might be such as to produce at some stage a great cosmic consciousness, an indwelling God arising from the whole process as human mind arises from human organisms. A naturalist would not object to that sort of God. The reason is this. Such a God would not stand outside nature or the whole total system, would not be existing on his own. It would still be the whole show, which was the basic fact, and such a God would merely be one of the things which the basic fact contained. What naturalism cannot accept is the idea of a God who stands outside nature and made it. So, there's a difference between thinking nature is all that exists and there is a God. You could imagine being a naturalist and believing in a God, just not a God that is outside of space and time. So these are two different questions. You could imagine, for example, that in the far future, our technological progress will give rise to a super advanced artificial general intelligence that has complete power and dominion over the universe. And maybe you'd call that God. Right? But if you're a naturalist, you wouldn't think that AI would be outside of time and space. It would still be part of the whole show. We are now in a position to state the difference between the naturalist and the supernaturalist, despite the fact that they do not mean the same by the word nature. The naturalist believes that a great process, or becoming, exists on its own in space and time, and that nothing else exists. What we call particular things and events being only the parts into which we analyze the great process, or the shapes which that process takes at given moments and given points in space. This single total reality he calls nature. The supernaturalist believes that one thing exists on its own and has produced the framework of space and time and the procession of systematically connected events which fill them. This framework and this filling he calls nature. It may or may not be the only reality which the one primary thing has produced. There might be other systems in addition to the one we call nature. Okay. So, can you rephrase that? What is the primary difference between the naturalist and the supernaturalist? Should I distill it down into what I think the primary difference is? You could think about it like this. The naturalist believes there is one thing that exists. Nature. Everything is a part of that thing. That's all that there is. Whereas the supernaturalist is going to say, what? How many things exist?
At least more than one something exists outside of nature.
At least two. There's what we call nature, and then there's this other thing that is outside of it. Yeah, so that's one way that you could understand their positions. They disagree fundamentally on how many things exist. I mean, colloquially, we can say, oh yeah, 10 trillion billion things exist, right? Da, 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 da. But if we boil it all down to, well, how did it get here? What is this? Blah, blah, blah. The naturalist thinks it's one thing. It's all part of the process of nature. The supernaturalists think there's the process of nature, and then there's this other thing. Usually God. In that sense, there might be several natures. If we imagine that there is a God who created this whole universe and set it all in motion, there might be several natures or systems or worlds, dimensions that God created, right? This conception must be quite distinct from what is commonly called plurality of worlds, different solar systems or different galaxies, island universes existing in widely separated parts of a single space-time. These, however remote, would be parts of the same nature as our own sun. It and they would be interlocked by being in relations to one another, spatial and temporal relations and causal relations as well. And it is just this reciprocal interlocking within a system which makes it what we call a nature. Other natures might not be spatio-temporal at all. Or, if any of them were, their space and time would have no spatial or temporal relation to ours. It is just this discontinuity, this failure of interlocking, which would justify us in calling them different natures. Or you could use a different placeholder, different dimensions, different universes. This does not mean that there would be absolutely no relation between them. They would be related by their common derivation from a single supernatural source. They would, in this respect, be like different novels by a single author. The events in one story have no relation to the events in another, except that they are invented by the same author. To find the relation between them, you must go right back to the author's mind. There is no cutting across from anything Mr. Pickwick says in Pickwick Papers to anything Mrs. Gamp hears in Martin Chuzzlewit. Similarly, there would be no normal cutting across from an event in one nature to an event in any other. By a normal relation, I mean one which occurs in virtue of the character of the two systems. We have to put in the qualification normal because we do not know in advance that God might not bring two natures into partial contact at some particular point. That is, he might allow selected events in one to produce results in the other. There would be thus at certain points a partial interlocking, but this would not turn the two natures into one. For the total reciprocity which makes a nature would still be lacking, and the anomalous interlockings would arise not from what either system was in itself, but from the divine act which was bringing them together. If this occurred, each of the two natures would be supernatural in relation to the other, but the fact of their contact would be supernatural in a more absolute sense. Not as being beyond this or that nature, but beyond any and every nature. It would be one kind of miracle. The other kind would be divine interference, not by the bringing together of two natures, but simply. Okay, so he just kind of went on a tangent there. Let's follow these trains of logic to their conclusion. Let's make the proper distinctions and logical analysis, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we don't care about that. We care about what comes next. All of this at present is purely speculative. It by no means follows from supernaturalism that miracles of any sort do in fact occur. God may never in fact interfere with the natural system he has created. If he has created more natural systems than one, he may never cause them to impinge on one another. Okay. So, here's what we have so far. When it comes to what exists, you're going to fall into one of two camps. You're either going to be a naturalist or a supernaturalist. If you're a naturalist, you're not going to think miracles are possible or actual by what we normally mean with that word, right? God intervening onto our planet. Why? Well, because if you're a naturalist, you likely don't believe there's a God. You likely don't think that there's something that exists outside of space and time. And consequently, there's nothing that exists that could intervene. So if you're a naturalist, miracles are impossible for you. But if you're a supernaturalist, they could be possible. Does that mean that they do and will happen? No. Why?
Because God can choose not to interfere.
Right. Maybe you have the following conception of God, which was popular during the Enlightenment. God set everything in motion. The whole universe is like a giant clockwork mechanism, and he wound it up and created the gears, but now he's just watching it all unfold. And he doesn't tinker with it. He's just like, oh, there goes the clock. You could believe God is like that. So, if you're a supernaturalist, that doesn't necessarily mean you think miracles exist or have happened. But that is a question for further consideration, and he will get into it later. If we decide that nature is not the only thing there is, then we cannot say in advance whether she is safe from miracles or not. There are things outside her. We do not yet know whether they can get in. The gates may be barred or they may not be. But if naturalism is true, then we do know in advance that miracles are impossible. Nothing can come into nature from the outside because there is nothing outside to come in, nature being everything. No doubt, events which we in our ignorance should mistake for miracles might occur, but they would in reality be an inevitable result of the character of the whole system. Our first choice, therefore, must be between naturalism and supernaturalism. And so, if we're going to try to answer this question whether miracles occur, we're going to have to figure that out. Which is true, naturalism or supernaturalism? So, what do you all think? Which view is the right one? Based on your limited knowledge, experience, arguments you've heard. Is everybody scared to offer their opinions? This is a no judgment zone, okay? Don't worry, I'm not going to tease you. How about this? Here's an argument for supernaturalism. If time and space came into existence at the Big Bang, what the fuck caused the Big Bang? And you're like, well, Professor Gunner, that doesn't necessarily mean a God exists. Yes, true. But it might give you reason to believe that something caused this to happen that lies outside of time and space. Okay, here's an argument for naturalism. Have you experienced a miracle? If you haven't, do you have reason to believe in supernaturalism? If you haven't seen a ghost or an angel or a demon, how much reason do you have to believe in that stuff? Yeah.
Could you consider being born a miracle?
Do you think it's a miracle?
I mean, what are the chances?
It happens every day, right? It's fairly common.
What are the chances of you being born?
I don't know. Maybe our existence is just a cosmic accident, right? Isn't that what a lot of people believe, right? There's no reason why I'm here. I just popped in. I was the lucky sperm. Right? Okay, so what do you all believe in? What do you think? You're agnostic about it. Yeah, okay. I think that's a reasonable position to hold at this point. Sure. Yeah.
Before an hour ago, I was leaning towards naturalist.
Okay.
But now I'm undecided.
Undecided. Okay. What caused you to be undecided?
He set up good arguments on both sides.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd say probably super because, like, even putting aside like the fact that I believe in God, I think it's hard to believe that this big explosion, which is usually, I mean, it's an explosion, right? It usually destroys, creates something as perfect as like the universe we have now. I think that's really hard to just imagine.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate. This shit doesn't seem perfect to me.
Well, I mean, yeah, but it's like, I think, I mean, I don't know the exact thing, but I think it's like, if gravity was like one, like, unit off, we'd all be dead. Or if it was 1 unit less, we'd be, you know, and if it was 1 unit more, we'd all be crushed. So it's like, I find it hard to believe that an explosion, which is so imperfect, creates something as perfect as, you know, the world we live in and allows us to inhabit it.
Sure. I mean, if you look at where all the bodies are in our solar system, I mean, our planet is like at the perfect spot for life. What are the odds of that? infinitesimal? And then what are the odds that life actually developed? And how did that happen? Dead matter spontaneously became a living organism somehow? How did that happen? Well, we don't really have good answers for any of these questions from the naturalist perspective of why we're here, how we got here, why there is something rather than nothing. But then again, you could say, look at the entire history of science. If we can explain everything in terms of physics, chemistry, biology, what reason is there to believe that a God created all this? Yeah, maybe, it is just by chance that we're here. Yeah, what's wrong with that? What are the problems with that? That doesn't seem like an unreasonable position, right? Based on our exploration and observation and investigation, it seems like we can completely explain our own origins in terms of, well, look, things evolved. Environment, natural selection, so on and so forth. Easy peasy. And then a Christian might shoot back with, well, look, Jesus was a pretty cool guy. He seemed pretty dope. In one of his books, Lewis says, you have to believe that Jesus was either crazy, a liar, or he was who he says he was. And it's unlikely that people would believe in a guy that they thought was crazy or a liar, so maybe that'll give you reason to believe he was who he says he was.
You believe in liars every day, you turn on TV.
Yeah, but he would say, though, look at the success that Christianity has had throughout human history. It's colonized entire empires and taken them over, and it has still survived. He's like, that might lead you to believe there's something real here. And then other people might just say, that could have happened with any of you. Christianity was just in the right place at the right time. In any case, I would encourage you to reflect on whether you think you're a supernaturalist or a naturalist. As we'll see, Lewis is going to go through several arguments for why you might believe in one position or the other position. But he's going to bring up some pretty interesting epistemological arguments against naturalism. How much time do we have left?
5 minutes.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Okay. Well, for after break, read chapter 3. I don't know if I'm having you read chapter 3 and 4. Look at the syllabus. You'll figure it out. In any case, be prepared to discuss the next chapter and perhaps the next 2 chapters as we go through our logical analysis of these 2 positions. Whether or not they're tenable, we have reasons to believe in them, etc.
This midterm course